I'm Venetia Rainey.
And I'm Arthur Scott-Geddes.
And this is Battle Lines Global Health Security. Welcome to a brand new series focusing on the fascinating intersection between health and security around the world.
Today, we're going to be talking about Disease X, the mystery pathogen which could cause the next pandemic.
History shows us that wars are the perfect petri dish for diseases.
So we'll be asking, could the next pandemic originate on the battlefields of Ukraine or in Gaza?
We've already seen lapses in control of HIV, lapses in control of tuberculosis, and we've also heard of Russian soldiers getting hantavirus, which is a virus that is spread through exposure to rodents.
Okay, so Arthur, before we get the guest in, what is Disease X? I haven't actually heard of that term before.
Well, it's a relatively new term that scientists use to describe the next as yet unknown pathogen that could emerge and, sort of like COVID did, tip the world into chaos.
So if Disease X doesn't exist yet, why should we care about it?
The interesting thing about Disease X is it's really designed to get people thinking about pandemics and these kinds of threats in a different way. Instead of looking at the diseases we know, we need to be thinking about the diseases that, could be just around the corner.
So it's like a thought experiment to get us to think differently about future-proofing ourselves disease-wise.
Yeah, it's more about, changing the way we think about these threats so that we can start building defences for them.
Well, we're joined now by a guest who knows lots about Disease X. Dr. Amesh Adalja works at the Johns Hopkins University Center for Health Security, where he covers emerging infectious diseases, pandemic preparedness, and biosecurity. So, Amesh, you've worked on US government panels tasked with developing guidelines for treatments of things like plague. You've written a NATO volume on bioterrorism. You've been deployed to Haiti after the earthquake in 2010. A lot of people might think that bacteria and viruses have nothing to do with defense. It's something to be left to the sciences. Why does health and security so often intersect?
Well, when you think about national security, one of the things that triggers a national security response is disruption to a society, disruption to a person's normal way of life, especially if it's happening very quickly. And infectious diseases are able to disrupt, as we all just saw during COVID-19, very rapidly, very quickly. So there's a natural tendency for infectious disease threats to also be national security threats. And that's not something new. That's not just after September 11th. This is something that goes back all the way to the Black Death, when governments were first tasked with controlling infectious disease outbreak, or even before that, thinking about the Peloponnesian War and the Plague of Athens and how that impacted the outcome of the Peloponnesian War between the Spartans and the Athenians.
Let's start with some of the basics. A lot of your work focuses on preparing for the next pandemic, and you were in stages of writing a book about this. Disease X. What, in layman's terms, how would you explain Disease X?
Disease X is a placeholder concept. It's basically meant to stand for something that's not on a list, something that we don't recognize as a threat to human health today. We can't just have a list-based way of thinking about biological threats, because there's going to be things that are not on that list that cause threats. So if you think about COVID-19 was not on the list, but obviously coronaviruses might have been. And I think what Disease X tells you is not that anything can be a threat to global health security, but there's going to be things that we haven't heard of, things that are in animal species that might be related to infections that we know, just like COVID is related to other coronavirus infections, but they're not going to be exactly the same. And you can't just continue to say, oh, we've prepared for anthrax, plague, tularemia, botulism. We've checked all the boxes. We're good. We're resilient. That's not the proper way to think about it, because the biological world is a lot more nuanced than that. And if you just prepare for what's on a list, you're not going to be prepared.
Are there any pathogens that you're looking at or that the global health community is looking at that you're particularly concerned about?
Avian influenza always is going to be at the top of the list. It would be at the top of the list in 2025. It would have been at the top of the list in 1925. That's the biggest human threat we face from a pandemic perspective. And influenza has caused several pandemics, and we have multiple different avian influenza viruses that are circulating at all times in waterfowl. Some of them are spilling into animals, and some of them are spilling into humans. So I think avian influenza, and it's not always going to be the one that's in the headlines that you think about, like H5N1, but others like H7N9. You often hear the press talk about bird flu as if it's one thing. It's not one thing. There's many, many different bird flu viruses that are always out there, and we have to keep abreast of all of them as they change their behavior, as they get into mammalian species, as they infect humans, to really guard against their ability to get a sustained ability to transmit between humans. We have to continually be vigilant about coronaviruses. They've showed their ability to cause pandemics. They've showed their ability to cause disruptive outbreaks, even short of pandemics, like in SARS and MERS. But when it comes to pandemic preparedness, I think it's really the respiratory viruses that lead the way, with avian influenza or bird flu viruses at the top.
We touched briefly on how conflict zones can help some of these pathogens to spread. Are there any conflicts going on that that you're monitoring, that you're concerned about?
So there are multiple conflicts always going on in the world, and sometimes hard to keep track of them all. But ones that really have had some role in infectious disease spread. One of them is the Russia-Ukraine war, where we've already seen lapses in control of HIV, lapses in control of tuberculosis, and we've also heard of Russian soldiers getting hantavirus, which is a virus that is spread through exposure to rodents. So that is one where there are major issues there. In the DRC right now, they're in the midst of an Ebola outbreak. The DRC has basically been, in my mind, in a continual civil war for some time, and had multiple Ebola outbreaks that have been very difficult to control because of the logistical challenges due to the violence that's going on. So that's another one that we think about. And there are other places in Sudan and South Sudan where there's major disruptions to humanitarian crises, and infectious disease always go together with those. But anytime you see disruptions in people's lives, disruptions in infrastructure and sanitation, crowding, lack of nutrition, you're going to see infectious diseases be able to, take hold. Remember that, humans, for almost all of our existence, lived like what it's like in those conflict zones, with no sanitation, no access to food, overcrowded, not able to wash our clothes, so we have ticks and fleas and things all over us, no clean water. It's only in the last 100, to maybe even 50 years that in the developed world, we're able to live free of infectious diseases. So if there was somebody watching humans over their whole time on Earth, they would say, well, that's more of the same. That's not, it's really us. It's really people in the developed worlds with high income economies that are the aberration, because we're the ones who are able to have the resources to beat back what is our natural state with vaccines, antibiotics, clean water, sanitation.
Is there a particular type of conflict that you think is more likely to incubate the next pandemic? For example, Gaza, where you have a small number of people trapped in a very contained space with very poor sanitary conditions, or somewhere like Sudan, where you have a huge number of people, 25 million people, affected by displacement and the conflict. Is there a particular type of war zone that you think makes it more likely?
When you're thinking about war zones and pandemics, I think you have to go back to what I was saying earlier, that I believe it's respiratory viruses that are basically the exclusive pandemic threat, and it's respiratory viruses from animal sources that find their way into humans. So any place where you have that combination, so that combination might not necessarily exist in a place like Gaza or in a place like Ukraine, but it might exist in a place like the DRC, where there is a lot of biodiversity, and you have people that are maybe they're consuming bushmeat, or maybe they have close contact with certain animals that are likely to harbor infectious diseases. So that's where I think it would be more likely. It's not necessarily every conflict can cause a pandemic. Every conflict can definitely cause infectious disease problems. So influenza, tetanus, cholera, norovirus, all of those types of things are going to happen all the time. But a pandemic threat, I think, is likely to have to come from some zoonotic threat. So there's going to have to be biodiversity in terms of the animals that they're exposed to. And, so if, to make a fictitious example, if there was a conflict in a poultry market where in a live wet market where people were living with different types of animals, and there's conflict and no sanitation, you need a bunch of different things to occur, I think, to spur a pandemic virus. But I think that's not to minimize the role of conflicts in the spread of infectious diseases that may be sub-pandemic level, epidemic level.
Do you think that this is a threat that people take seriously enough?
In the military, they take it very seriously. If you think, even going back into the United States, if you think about all of our conflicts, more people have died from infectious diseases in those conflicts historically than from actual war related injuries. So it is something that's taken very seriously by militaries. I think the general public probably know, policymakers, some of them probably have understood this. Not all of them understand this. And again, I think it comes back to the fact that we live, at least in the developed world, in the luxury of not thinking about these infectious diseases, not realizing that, that if you think of all these pathogens, I think of them as barbarians at the gate, and it's our technology and science that have kept them at bay. And during a conflict, during a war, a lot of that technology breaks down. And I think that's a far leap for people to understand that, up until the 1950s, malaria was all over the United States. People can't fathom that malaria was a common illness, or that a yellow fever outbreak during George Washington's administration forced the government to evacuate Philadelphia at that time. They don't actually think that happened, that George Washington was scared of yellow fever, and had to flee on horseback from Philadelphia, and the government couldn't operate the first U.S. administration. That's, I think, gone from most people's minds. I think, and that's a good thing. That's a testament to the success of science technology, that a lot of people don't have to think about all that stuff.
I love the language that you use there, the barbarians at the gate. And I wonder if you think our public health officials, our governments, should be using more of that kind of stirring rhetoric, should be treating this as the next pandemic as a looming war, and applying that sort of urgency and defensive, offensive thinking to it.
I do think that, and there had been some pushback of using that type of language with public health. People say, this is the over securitization of public health. But I think you have to think that way, because if you think of, humans in this battle to flourish and survive on this planet that is completely dominated by microorganisms. If you were an alien trying to survey Earth, you would say, that's a planet of bacteria, fungi, viruses, protozoa, parasites, and some other things. That's what they would say.
Us being the some other things.
Yeah. Even a human body has more bacterial cells in it than human cells. So the fact is, there are always going to be threats. Most of them don't cause problems to us, but that percentage that do cause a threat are things that we have to guard against. And you think about human life. What was the biggest barrier to human flourishing? It's always been infectious disease. It's said that half of all humans that have ever lived died of malaria. Not died from an atomic bomb, not died from gunshot wounds, not died from violence, but from malaria. So if that's the biggest threat that humans face to our continued ability to flourish on this planet, yes, you have to think that way. And it's not just thinking that way about biological weapons that the Soviet Union was developing, but even the natural threats that we face. And you need to have that kind of a mindset that we're trying to make the human species resilient to these threats so that we can all live longer, better, more productive lives. And to do that, we have to really think about these threats in a way that reflects their impact, their potential impact on human life. And yes, I do think we need to use those types of metaphors, because that, if you think, I think of it kind of on a millennial timescale rather than just, the next election cycle. And that's the problem, is that the people that think about this stuff understand this as a struggle for existence from the inception of humans. And the people that we task with solving these problems are our politicians, who think of it in, is this going to get me votes or not get me votes? Am I going to get reelected or not reelected? Am I going to be in favor with the political leader of my party, or am I not? That's what they think about. They're not thinking, they're not big thinkers. They're not incentivized to think big. They're incentivized to think as small and as narrow as possible.
One of the most striking features of almost all the conflicts raging today seems to be high numbers of attacks on healthcare infrastructure and health facilities. So in Ukraine, I think up to the beginning of this year, there had been over 2,200 attacks on health facilities. We've seen lots of the same sort of thing happening in Gaza. How does that play into the risk of a pathogen, emerging? Why is that so concerning?
When you think about healthcare infrastructure, it is part of the technology that keeps infectious diseases at bay. And when you disrupt it, it's going to have a predictable consequence. So if you, even as simple as, a tuberculosis clinic in Ukraine gets bombed by the Russians, now those people don't have the ability to get their tuberculosis medications or get diagnostic testings. Then tuberculosis cases worsen. Then tuberculosis cases become more contagious. Then they spread. Then those new people can't be diagnosed, and the cycle repeats.
And what about our ability to sort of maintain surveillance networks? How hard is that in a war zone?
It's impossible. If people are trying to, if people are running to air raid shelters, if people are worried about surviving the night, if people are trying to hide from soldiers, they're not going to be able to be looking at tallies of cases of salmonella or HIV. That's a secondary concern when survival becomes the first concern.
I wonder if I could turn to this issue of anti-microbial resistance, which is basically where bacteria develop resistance to the antibiotics that we use to treat them. We're seeing a sort of surge in cases of drug-resistant infections in Ukraine. What could the longer-term ramifications of that be for both for Ukraine and for the rest of the world?
What happens is people get wounds, they get shrapnel wounds, and those wounds get infected, and they're in areas where they're in healthcare facilities that are military healthcare facilities, which may not have the ability to do strong infection control. These bacteria infect wounds, and they become more and more difficult to treat. So you're in a situation where you've got bad bugs and no drugs to treat them. And what could be a simple infection becomes very complicated to find an antibiotic to counter it. And these things can spread. They can become endemic in an area after a war zone, even after the war, that then the bacteria in that region are just all acclimatized to the antibiotics and they have a higher rate of resistance. And it makes it more difficult for everybody, not just the soldiers who got infected, because you now have the endemicity of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. And antibiotic-resistant bacteria is not just about getting infected. Remember, we use antibiotics to make lots of parts of medicine safe, like giving someone chemotherapy or giving someone a liver transplant or a lung transplant, or even putting in a pacemaker or putting in an artificial hip. We give people antibiotics to make sure they don't get infected. We give it prophylactically. If a person is colonized with drug-resistant bacteria, it makes it very dangerous to do even these simple things that are part and parcel of modern medicine. So antimicrobial resistance is a slow, simmering public health threat, but might be the biggest, or arguably the biggest, long-term threat that we face. And it's something that Alexander Fleming predicted.
You mentioned a few historical examples earlier, and I just want to come back to that because I know our audience will be fascinated to hear more. Is there a particular war that you think is particularly instructive to think about in terms of how it incubated a particular disease or pandemic or outbreak?
I think you have to say World War I, because World War I did spawn a pandemic. So World War I happening around 1918, the H1N1 influenza pandemic occurs right on the heels of it. The leading data now says that this didn't come from China, this didn't come from France. It probably came from Kansas in the United States in a camp there.
Where is this Spanish flu? Is that what it was called?
Yes. It's called Spanish flu because Spain was a neutral country and did not have censorship. In the United States, the United Kingdom had censorship, so they couldn't call it. They couldn't report on it. So only Spain could report on it.
Should have been called the Kansas flu. Is that right?
Yes. In Haskell, Kansas, and in Camp Funston, I think is where the leading hypothesis is that this might have originated, where a bird virus went into humans and then was able to spread, especially in those army training camps where everybody was crowded together in congregated, poorly ventilated areas, and then was able to spread on ships all over the globe, and maybe 100 million people died. So that happened during, it traveled at the speed of a steamship. That's 1918. And in 2025, things travel at the speed of a jetliner. So things can happen much more fast than happened in 1918. But World War I think, is one of the best examples of pandemic synergy or infection synergy with war.
So even though, all of us lived through the COVID pandemic, as a journalist, it can often be difficult to get people to take the threat of future pandemics seriously. I wonder if you could just paint a picture of what would actually the worst case scenario be? Why do we need to be well prepared for disease X?
COVID is not a major pandemic on the scale that we would even consider 1918. So if you think about the case fatality ratio of COVID, how many people died that got infected? It's probably around 0.6. 1918 was 1 to 2% and killed 100 to 200 million or 100 million people in a time when the globe was much smaller. The world population was not 7 billion people or however many we have now. So you have to think that what you saw in COVID with the morgues, the morgue trucks in New York City, with hospitals busting at the seams, would be much, much worse, even if you had something that was twice as lethal as COVID, 1.2%, which is getting to the 1918 level. And we couldn't even handle COVID globally as a world, as a planet. So you have to think that things could get really, really grim if you had something that had much higher mortality rates, especially if, for example, if it was like 1918, where the average age of death was 27. That's really, really disruptive and scary to a society, versus COVID, where the average age of death was above 65. I think that, but the thing is that that's not a foregone conclusion. Many people devote their lives and careers, including me, to thinking about this threat and figuring out how to be proactive. The problem is that politics enters this, and it's very hard to get them to be proactive about anything, because their time horizon, again, is the latest election, not 20 years down the road. And I think what we In a way, if you going back to militaristic thinking, the way people thought about the Cold War and the arms race and in the Reagan years, and they actually were thinking forward. They were being proactive. And I think we have to think about pandemics in that same way, with that same national security mindset.
So how ready are we really for disease X?
I think arguably we're worse off than before COVID-19, not because we don't have the technological solutions, but because now pandemic preparedness and public health preparedness is integrated into politics, that there is a right-wing way to do this, a left-wing way to do this, and no longer is there an objective correct way to do this. So in many ways, in the United States, for example, mRNA vaccines, which are one of the heroes of the COVID-19 pandemic, the federal government has ceased Health and Human Services funding for mRNA vaccine technologies. And imagine if you tried to do an Operation Warp Speed now in the United States in 2025, it would not happen. We have RFK Jr. as the Secretary of Health and Human Services. This is not going to, and he doesn't even believe in the germ theory of disease. So I think that we're in a much worse scenario than we were.
Okay, so final question. How close do you think we are to another pandemic?
It could be happening right now. The first jumps of a new virus into humans could be happening right now as we're speaking. We never know. Think about how many diseases don't get diagnosed, the one-offs that happen. Some rare disease happens and the person dies or they get better and no one figured out what was wrong with them. Those could be the first jumps of a pandemic pathogen. Just go through the hospital right now, walk through the intensive care unit and see how many sick people are there and ask the physician, what's the diagnosis? What did you isolate? And so we didn't isolate anything. We're very poor at diagnosing infectious diseases, so we won't even know the first cases of some new pathogen will likely go unnoticed, just like SARS-CoV-2, the cause of COVID, went unnoticed until it bubbles over.
That was Dr. Amesh Adalja from the Johns Hopkins University Center for Health Security.
Now, earlier today, I spoke to the science writer Laura Spinney to find out about the last time a war sparked a global pandemic. Hi, Laura. Thanks for joining us. So, how did the First World War help spark the Spanish flu?
So you have the first wave of that pandemic, which we shouldn't call the Spanish flu because it wasn't Spanish, even though the name has tended to stick, in the spring of 1918. And the thinking is that throughout that ensuing summer, the pandemic variant of the flu became very much more transmissible amongst humans. So you had a sort of background of normal seasonal flu in that spring. That then receded. You had the pure pandemic variety, which was far more virulent. And that erupted in the early autumn of 1918, when, first of all, you had massive troop movements, massive movements of civilians who had been displaced. And then from, obviously, the armistice, the beginning of those troops being demobilized and returning back home, often to huge welcoming parties. So, a kind of perfect storm of conditions for spreading a very contagious and, in that case, very lethal strain of respiratory disease around the world.
What impact did the spread of all this infection, the spread of all this sickness have on the way the war was conducted?
Probably accelerated the end of the war. I think most historians would agree with that. Whether it affected the outcome is more contentious. There is a theory that it interfered with some of the spring operations in a way that favoured the Allies and did not favour the Axis forces. The theory is based on thinking about the timing of the eruption of the disease in the trenches and the fact that the Germans and their allies were ahead before that disease made its appearance and then were gradually set back, basically, until they were defeated. And it has to do with the fact that they were also relatively quite hungry compared to Allied troops and also the civilian German population because of the naval blockade that had been imposed at that time.
I wonder if you could paint me a picture of what it must have been like, at that time when these soldiers suddenly found that they had, a new enemy to face, essentially. How aware of the problem, were the commanders? What sort of precautions could people take to prevent the spread of infection?
If they were present, if they were on the field themselves, they were definitely aware of the devastation that the disease was causing in the trenches. And we have sort of first-hand accounts on both sides of that, men dropping dead like flies and, really horrifying stories. Unfortunately, often the war took priority. And so you see, for example, continuing transports across the Atlantic of troop ships And, ships arriving from the States, for example, in France, where, they've been decimated in the crossing at the Atlantic, and men are dead and sick and in large and horrifying numbers. Similar picture in the trenches. So I think, in many cases they considered it a lesser evil that they had to manage, even if eventually, it obviously weakened their fighting forces and their fighting strength, and as we've already discussed, may have had an impact on the outcome of battles and ultimately the war.
So against the backdrop of this conflict, you've now got a flu that goes on to kill between 50 and 100 million people. 1 in 3 people are infected. What effect does this have on the world?
It left a huge dent in the sort of demographic profile of the global population, because that flu was very devastating, not only to the very young and the very old, like most flus, but also to a middle-aged group, people essentially in the prime of life. People talk about the lost generation, the young men with promising futures who were slaughtered in the First World War. But if you consider it purely numerically, many more of the same generation and across society were taken out by the 1918 flu.
When you look at a conflict like Ukraine today, do you have concerns that history could repeat itself?
History is repeating itself, although you wouldn't call it a pandemic. I mean, bear in mind that in every conflict of the 18th and 19th centuries, more people died from the diseases that came in the wake of the conflict than from the conflict itself. In Gaza, in Ukraine, also in Sudan at the moment, which unfortunately tends to get a bit overlooked compared to the other two conflicts, infectious diseases are on the rampage, including polio, which of course paralyzes people for life if it's not treated in time. And that is almost directly due to the fact that vaccination programs have been interrupted in those places. The strain that's circulating is the type 2 strain that is derived from the vaccine. So that could have been prevented if the vaccination programs had been kept in place, potentially. But there are many other diseases circulating as well. And perhaps the biggest risk in those places is antimicrobial resistance. The fact that because of the misuse of antibiotics, and that's not a criticism of anyone, it's essential for treating traumatic injuries, unfortunately, in emergency situations, there are bugs, bacteria, viruses and so on that are evolving antimicrobial resistance, and there are already some that are not treatable by any known antibiotic or antimicrobial. So AMR, antimicrobial resistance, is already a bigger killer than HIV and malaria. It's being fueled in those places, but it won't be restricted to those places. It won't respect borders. And that could potentially be the next pandemic. So, it's not good. We are trying to develop new antibiotics and other antimicrobials. AI will help a lot with that, with the design of such drugs. But we're in a race against time, and the conflicts are not helping.
Laura, thank you so much for joining us.
That's all for today's episode. We'll be back again next Wednesday. Until then, goodbye.
Goodbye.